Hi there, and welcome to our very last lecture in the Renaissance and Reformation course. And today we'll be talking about the Catholic Reformation. Now, I'm going to use that term specifically because in the literature you will often see the term Counter-Reformation, the implication being that the events that unfolded were really just a reaction to, a counter to the Protestant Reformation and the various sects and the changes that they made in the breakup of Western Christendom. And I think recent scholarship has tended to look at the roots of the Catholic Reformation really that precede the Protestant Reformation, things that have their roots in the Middle Ages, especially reform movements. We saw the conciliar movement, we saw the mendicant orders like the Franciscans, but I think even the attempt to kind of clean up all the clerical abuses happened really within the Catholic Church earlier than the Protestant Reformation, right up to the point where Erasmus was talking about reforming the church. Well, there are certainly precedents that go back through the Middle Ages that claim that the clergy should be educated and that they should remain celibate, that they should have, if not personal, poverty, if not corporate poverty, then certainly personal. They shouldn't be wealthy in and of themselves, and that they should actually do their job, right? They should be in their place and serve their duties, not have, many different positions, and obviously not doing all of them. So I think, in fairness to this whole movement, we'll see that much of the impetus behind the Catholic reform really does come within the Christian Church itself. But on the other hand, the term is useful because there are some very, very new things that happen that give a new kind of energy and vibrancy to the Catholic Church. And now we can use that term properly, Roman Catholic, as distinguished from all the other sects. But I should say, the term Counter-Reformation, it does imply a kind of knee-jerk reaction, and to be fair, that was sort of the initial response to the Protestant Reformation that came from the church itself and from the civil authorities. The Inquisition, I think, not only in attacking Christian humanists by a mistake, really, but eventually attacking real Protestants, was one way that this was just a kind of attack on the way they would have attacked heretics earlier in the Christian Church. The Inquisition is really just a form of repression that tried to, at first destroy, heresy, but I think even heterodoxy, meaning having lots of different forms of faith, and to a large extent succeeded, right? I mean, you don't really see a Protestant movement in Spain, and you don't in Italy either, for that matter. And in France, obviously it is there, but it isn't repressed in the same way. So early on, I think you can say, yeah, sure, there is a negative reaction. Individuals who were accused of Protestantism would have been handed over to civil authorities and punished. So this was something the states actually participated in entirely also. And I think in the first, let's say, few decades of the Reformations, it was not entirely clear whether they couldn't come to a theological compromise, whether there couldn't be a reform that would accommodate all the various sects and bring them back into the fold. I think there were certainly many members of the Catholic Church who wanted that to happen, who believed it was still possible, and even wanted to put in theological reforms along the same lines, just keeping the Pope in place, right? I mean, that was not an unthinkable thing, certainly not in the 1520s and 30s. When it came to pass that the church said, okay, we now need to not just hand down papal dispensations and bulls and things and push people around, is that we actually have to get together and confirm what we believe. We have to make a creed, in a sense. We have to have a council. Now that's unusual. I mean, there have been councils, obviously, but getting everyone together and finally saying, okay, let's straighten all of this out, and it will be the authority of the council that is greater than that of the Pope himself. So that, I think, in and of itself is a momentous kind of occasion. The council we're talking about was called by Paul III in 1545, so it's pretty late, right? We're talking 20 years down the road. And there's my garbage truck. So the Council of Trent lasts all the way from 1545 to 1563. It's interrupted by plague. It moves for various times. So it's not just one quick affair that's over with, and there's a lot of argument that goes on in the course of it. And it is the fact that it takes place in Trent also. Trento is all the way up in the north of Italy, but right before you get to the Alps. It's technically within the empire, and I think that was a conscious choice so the emperor could look over it, and so it wouldn't just be the Pope's buddies and his people in his control. So they consciously did not have it in Rome. Okay, I think that's the importance of that. And in a nutshell, what they do is re-stress every single point that the Protestant Reformation took away. So in a sense, it is completely the opposite of the Protestant Reformation. And I think you can, not just theologically, but I think the whole aesthetic approach to worship, the things that are stressed, they of course change in the course of the 16th and especially 17th century, but they are the rituals become central to the whole form of worship in a way that they're not so much in Protestant religions. The sacraments themselves are re-emphasized, their importance, the stress on them. The worship of saints continues and in fact in many ways intensifies in the Baroque era. The separation of the priesthood as a separate specially ordained, not just anyone can be a priest. You have to go through this entire process of ideally education, which of course does happen, and ordination, which means that you remain celibate. And I should mention that this is really the only Christian sect that requires clerical celibacy. It's the only one left in the early modern and modern times. But I think more importantly is what the Council of Trent decides is that they're going to emphasize the dazzling effects of worship, the kind of theatricality, the beauty and mystery of the Latin Mass in all of its grandeur and glory, and also in the introduction of a kind of mysticism that's very new. And of course there are mystics throughout all of Christianity, but these are kind of vibrant, ecstatic, energetic sorts of forms of worship. A new whole type of writing really comes out of this, and I think that changes the flavor of Catholicism in a way that makes it diametrically opposed to the sort of simple text-based worship of the Protestant sects that, simple churches, sermons, words. The Catholic Church emphasizes the vestments again, the swinging of the incense, the stained glass windows, the organ music, the singing of the Mass in these beautiful composed pieces in a way that kind of dazzles the senses, that appeals to every single, the sights, the sounds, the smells, the mystery of the entire experience becomes the aesthetics focus of worship. And you can understand why it kind of gets people back in a way that the bland sort of Calvinist, stern, textual based biblical literalism wouldn't. This is exactly the opposite. And in fact, the interesting thing is the Bible does not get translated into Italian or Spanish or the vernacular languages of Catholic Europe, and it doesn't become part of the worship either. It's like but it's very different than the Middle Ages because it's a kind of new energy to the whole thing. And lastly, and I think probably the most important thing that happens, and I'll go into this in a little detail, is a new form of militant organization, a new holy order, in fact, called the Jesuits, who are something entirely new in the history of Christianity and are kind of let's call them the shock troops of the Catholic Reformation, and they are in fact organized like an army. So I think that is, and as you probably know, they're still around to this day in businesses that not just missionary efforts, but in education. And I think that's one very, very important, very different thing than has ever happened before. So let's look at some of the sort of external forms of Roman Catholicism that get put in place here in the middle of the 16th century, and they remain in place all the way up until the time that I was born. So the Vatican II Council took place in 1964 and de-emphasized the relics and saint worship and a lot of other things. You could have a mass in the vernacular, but really the shape of Catholicism for those, what is it, 15, 16, 17, 18, for those 400 years is set in the Council of Trent. And I'd like to look at just some of the doctrinal issues. The question, of course, that arises in their minds is, when we're setting dogma and when we're setting church practice, do we follow the text of the Bible, or do we admit all of these traditions that have come into the church over the centuries? And of course, the latter is what they do. They re-emphasize the traditions. Do we keep things like infant baptism, which is not in the Bible? And of course they do. Do we keep the Trinity, which is not in the Bible? But of course they do. That's central to very few Christian sects will get rid of the Trinity. And the question, of course, was, who has ultimate authority in this? Is it the Pope? Is it the Council? Is it? And so there are other, important issues at stake. Should the church be poor? Well, their argument was, well, then we can't do any work at all. We can't do anything if we have no money. And even though the Bible said we should, and, remember, it's harder for a rich person to get into the heaven than a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. Well, okay, then there might be personal poverty, but the church itself should not be poor. So the Council of Trent decrees, one, is that there should be a confession of faith itself. There's a creed, something you say, I believe in this. And again, that's what really I've been arguing separates it from medieval Christianity, which was all things you do. Now it's actually includes things you believe. And they define, and that's sort of unprecedented in the Catholic Church. Obviously, there's always been a form of orthodoxy, and they've enforced it, but they've never had a thing that everyone would say, I believe this. And the idea, of course, is the assumption is you're going to educate people to say that, right, and to understand it at some level. So before this, I guess the other thing to mention, and this just pops into my head, is that in defining orthodoxy and dogma, in other words, the things that you need to believe to get saved, the authority they go back to, and this is going to seem really ironic and strange considering everything that we've talked about in the course thus far about the rejection of scholasticism, but they turn to Thomas Aquinas as the arbiter in all theological matters, and the sort of Thomist thread becomes foremost. Now, obviously, they have lots of different scholars and commentators that they will rely on, but Thomas becomes the kind of dominant doctor of the church, the figure who overwhelmingly the theology becomes Thomist. And in fact, there are still theologians who you could describe as Thomists to this day. So that seems ironic, that kind of medieval legacy, it stays there through the Middle Ages, as I've mentioned, but it comes to the fore when we get to the Council of Trent, and usually they defer to him. And in some ways, theologically, obviously, we'll see the Council of Trent is conservative, right? And so it kind of makes sense. But first of all, let's start with the Vulgate is reconfirmed, meaning the Latin translation of St. Jerome. Maybe I'll read you some passages out of the whole thing. I think I've got the text here. The Council of Trent, I do have this, hang on. I don't know whether it's important just to read the actual words of it, but third session, fourth session, the edition of sacred books. Let me read this. So we ordain and declare that the old Latin Vulgate edition, meaning that translation of St. Jerome, which in use for so many hundreds of years has been approved by the Church be in public lectures, disputations, sermons, and expositions held as authentic, that no one dare or presume under any pretext whatsoever to reject it, meaning you may not do a new translation. Furthermore, to check unbridled spirits, it decrees that no one, relying on his own judgment, shall in matters of faith and morals pertaining to the edification of Christian doctrine, distorting Holy Scripture in accordance with his own conceptions, presume to interpret them contrary to the sense which the Holy Mother Church, to whom it belongs to judge of their true sense and interpretation, has held and holds. Meaning that you can't interpret that book yourself. Okay, we will decide for you. We'll tell you how to interpret that, and most importantly, it may not be translated. You cannot put this in the hands of people, because that will be completely mess. So the interesting thing is, whereas the Protestant churches look to the Bible as the bedrock of Christianity, the Catholic Church keeps the Bible in the hands of theologians, and they will argue about it. They'll continue, but not in hands of ordinary people. It's not a book anyone would have to read or look at. To this end, to kind of achieve their goal in preventing interpretation and splintering and lots of different ideas, they put in place the Index of Forbidden Books. Now, I should mention this because it, in a sense, kind of closes the intellectual speculation that we saw like in the era of Erasmus, just recently. That kind of criticism from within almost comes to a stop, because all books must be officially approved by the censors, and every book has to have that page, approved by this bishop or that, or they can't be published. So censorship becomes rigorous, and a lot of books that had already been published were put on the Index of Forbidden Books. Luther, obviously, but also Erasmus, I think, Machiavelli, very clearly, a whole set of books that kind of stultify Southern Europe intellectually, if you want to say, and you could say also scientifically, because we'll see, down the road, speculation about things that the Bible really was never meant to be an authority on, like the Earth being at the center of the universe. Well, you can't even speculate about that. Think of Galileo. The other question, and this is one that we know has been kind of played out in the course of all these various reformations, is what is original sin? What does that actually mean? Because remember, some Protestant churches hold it, the radicals don't, the antinomians don't, so that they have to actually define this. They have to say, yes, every single person is born a sinner, and without the cleansing grace of the sacraments, you cannot get into heaven. And that means that someone who does not have a priest cannot be saved. It's why ultimately when they send missions out to South America and to Asia, they have to have a priest with them, and they have to have a church. They build physical churches, and they have to baptize people. It seems kind of bizarre to us that, I don't know, Cortez would have wandered into Mexico, and the first thing they want to do is start baptizing people, giving them new names. Like, what is that going to accomplish, right? If they don't understand the language or know anything, well, it's because they can't be saved unless they have been baptized. And so original sin is, and it really, all of this is prompted by the issue of infant baptism. Should you do that or not? And the idea is that, yes, they, children are condemned from birth, so get them baptized as soon as possible. It's not, corruption is not something that just comes in as you get older, and then you need to willingly accept that you're joining into the church. This is something you're born with. So that's an important issue. I think maybe even the more important issue is what gets you into heaven in the first place, right? Is it, this is approached very subtly, and what they come down to is, because they can't contradict Paul, right, is that, yes, faith is what gets you saved. But it's not only faith. The works are a necessary accompaniment to the faith, and without them, the faith is fruitless. And that's really an answer to Luther. They say you need both of these things, and that this is to counter the idea that, well, I believe, and therefore I'm saved, and I can do whatever I want, right? They're thinking that's what's going to go through people's minds, is that the good works and obviously the sacraments is the way they interpret that, not helping old ladies across the street, are necessary for salvation, and that reconfirms the central necessary authority of the priesthood and the church itself, right? I mean, if you need those sacraments, it's not just faith, so that you need the rituals, you need the objects, you need the liturgical, you need the art that's there for a purpose, not just to kind of help you along in your faith. It's there because it will get you grace. It'll get you into heaven. It'll give you those brownie points, if you want to think of it that way. The images are still necessary. So, of course, we'll keep crucifixes, we'll keep images of saints, we'll keep, and in fact, they become more intense in some ways. Let me see if I can give you a little passage on this. And in many ways, the art form that flourishes, that really is kind of the cornerstone of Counter-Reformation, Catholic Reformation success, is the Baroque. We'll talk about that in a bit more. Let me just read this. So, the faith, strength always precedes, accompanies, and follows with their good works, without which they could not be in any matter pleasing or meritorious to God. That which is at the present moment and light of our tribulation worketh above measure, exceeding an eternal glory. Nevertheless, far be it that a Christian should either trust or glory in himself and not in the Lord. And I know this is hard to interpret. What they're saying is about justification, that faith alone will not get you there. Okay, let me read this. If anyone says the sinner is justified by faith alone, meaning that nothing else is required to cooperate in order to obtain the grace of justification, and that it is not in any way necessary that he be prepared and disposed by the action of his own will, let him be anathema. Okay, that's calling something anathema is a very serious deal. And I think that they they're protecting their own business in some ways, right? I mean, the dispensation of the sacraments and all that is their business, their job. So in a sense, if they were to say, well, you don't really need this stuff, their business is gone, right? Their revenue is gone in a sense. I know that sounds a little cynical, but I think that's part of the whole story. The importance of penance as a sacrament is also stressed again. Many of the Protestant sects did away with it, but again, why is that important? Because you have to confess to a priest, someone who's different from you, in a special kind of, who's taken holy orders. But it means that there is, that person is necessary. No community can exist without an ordained priest, and the sort of devout exercises accompany this penance. And that's something that's really not, I mean, it's there in the Middle Ages, but it becomes stressed, saying prayers with the rosary beads over and over again. They're there in the Middle Ages, but they're stressed in the Catholic Reformation. And exercises that are supposed to strengthen your faith. And I think those come to the fore in the Catholic Reformation. There are a couple of other theological points, but in a nutshell, the 7 sacraments are reconfirmed. The Council of Trent, of course, makes very conservative, there's a hummingbird right over my head, still very conservative decisions, and they sort of reconfirm the magical status of the prince. The fact that when the Mass is celebrated, a miracle is actually occurring. They re-stress the real presence, right, of in the Eucharist. And in any case, so that's the first session, makes these very important theological decisions. When they break and they come back, this is not until 1551 that they come back. They have to really tackle this issue of the real presence, and the Mass remains the central event in the Christian calendar. The Baroque altars, the sort of majesty and mystery of the entire event becomes and not just that, but I would say that the clerical liturgical instruments, the monstrance, the big bright star where they show the host to everyone in the congregation, the pyx that contains it, the vestments, the crozier, the swinging of incense, all that stuff, the chalices, become re-emphasized and accentuated. They were there in the Middle Ages. They become central to everything. The splendor, and maybe I can just give you a little passage to give you a sense in the text itself, where they decide this. The host should be borne reverently with honor and procession through the streets and in public places, was very piously and religiously introduced into the Church of God. For it is most reasonable that some days be set aside as holy, on which all Christians may with special and unusual demonstration testify that their minds are grateful to the mind of their common Lord and Redeemer, so ineffable and truly divine favor, whereby the triumph and glory of his death are shown forth. And indeed, it is to behoove the victorious truth to celebrate a triumph over falsehood and heresy, that in the sight of so much splendor, in the midst of so much great joy of the universal church, her enemies may either vanish, weakened or broken, or overcome with shame and confounded, and at length repent. So you can see that they are consciously saying, we're going to use the splendor of the church as a tool to battle heresy and Protestantism and bring people back into the fold. And I think they do that, exactly that, right? The other thing to mention, I won't read it, but is they reaffirm that they're getting the sacrament in only one kind, meaning they're just getting bread. There's no wine involved in this. That gets changed down the road, but for the moment there is none. The later, and this is another, this is 1560s. I mean, this is a decade later. They explain the theological value of art, the veneration of images, the worship of relics, the things that will get you credit with God to get out of purgatory early, the power of indulgences, all that stuff is reconfirmed, believe it or not. And the idea that the church is infallible, the idea that whatever we say is right, stays in place. So I don't want to go into the Council of Trent in too great a detail, because you know those details already. The structure of salvation is reaffirmed. Okay, that's what you need to remember. But I think the other very important thing that the Catholic Reformation does is the issue of church discipline, of the hierarchy. What kind of church government are we going to have if it had so many problems and there was corruption within it? How are we going to reform those abuses? How are we going to make sure the clergy behave and are educated? And if we're going to get people back into the fold, they have to be the front line. They have to be educated. So I think one way was to punish priests who had unorthodox ideas. Those who were not celibate, those who were homosexual, were actually persecuted to a greater extent than I think they ever were before. There's this interesting literature on that. I think there's an assumption that's sort of been a thread through Catholicism and in some or through Christianity, and that some periods people are persecuted and some they are not. This is one in which they are. The requirement that priests be resident, that if they have a position in a place, they have to actually live there and not just be a sinecure where they're getting the money and not doing anything. And to do this, bishops would go on visitations. They would show up and say, okay, let's see, are you keeping a girl? Are you, living in here? Are you ministering to your congregation? And so that they're trying to put in a kind of self-policing system that will work. And very interestingly also, remember, universities are they're part of the church in a way. the kind of wild speculation that occurred even as recently as in the late 15th century with Ficino and Pico and into the early 16th century, that comes to a crashing halt. Is that ungodly disputation is forbidden. You can comment on theology, you can talk about it and teach it, or strengthen it, but the kind of speculation and certainly the kind of syncretic bringing in of other traditions, absolutely forbidden now. And I think that's why that particular strain of syncretic Neoplatonism just really kind of comes to an end. Is that it becomes dangerous. You get on the index, you'd have inquisitors after you, you'd be in a lot of trouble. And I think the important thing here, and again, Galileo, this is why Galileo gets in trouble. Even the government of the papacy is reorganized in ways that I've seen people argue look like the modern state. In other words, how are they going to tax efficiently? How are they going to have officers in the bureaucracy that will police the other ones? How are they going to rigorously structure the church? And I think in many ways that makes sense, is the kinds of reforms we saw in the early modern state are adopted by the papacy also. And remember, of course, the papal states are still a state, right? They're central Italy, but I think in a way that they wanted to enforce orthodoxy among the whole clergy and strengthen the administration, they do that, okay? In ways that look like modern statecraft. This is, again, in the era of Pope, the guy who was Cardinal Carafa was his name. He was a cardinal to start with, and then he became Pope Paul IV, who was a real fanatic about bureaucratic rigor, stepped up the Inquisition to persecute heretics, and put out this index of forbidden books, and burning of books, frankly. And it's not just Erasmus and Machiavelli, it's Rabelais gets put on it, so, because it's dirty, right? So, and most important is that the most positive effect of all of this, I would say, is the requirement that the clergy be educated, that there be seminaries that it's all in Latin still, remember, but that you have to pass exams and be proficient in the things you're supposed to be teaching, and really a kind of rigorous system of education is put in place in the era of Pope Paul V. And I should mention, even just as important, is that the papacy itself gets a new image. And that's really the work of a guy who's Pius V, who's Pope from 1566 to 72, is himself a saint. Okay, so the Pope now becomes an ascetic. He lives a very, very frugal life and provides a model in a way that you obviously know. Leo X and Julius II lived very, very worldly lives. Pius V is the one who had the dirty bits of the Last Judgment by Michelangelo painted over because he didn't want genitals in the Sistine Chapel. Pius V, I should mention also, the strangest thing about Pius V is there was a guy, Bartolomeo Scappi, who, if you remember back to when we were talking about food, I mentioned him, he's one of the subjects of my own research, was appointed late in his life as the private chef to Pope Pius V. And I've always thought, what the poor guy, after spending a whole lifetime creating these magnificent, culinary creations for the papal court, all of a sudden gets a job for the real sourpuss of Pius V, who only ate cold toast, without butter. So, it seemed like such a punishment. And I think poor Scappi actually retired in these years, went back to his home in Dumenza and said, forget it, I'm not doing this. And his cookbook came out in 1570. I think it was after his death, in fact. But in any case, the work of Pius V, very important in building seminaries to teach people, to enforce correct doctrine, and also teaching the congregation. The whole idea of catechisms, that just means kind of like a church school everyone goes to learn the faith. Teaching prayers, emphasis on rosaries, eventually new texts that they do read. Now, what they are reading is not the Bible, but they're missals, breviaries, things that will tell you here's what you have to believe, and you more or less memorize them, right? I mean, that's the form of education which mirrors that kind of medieval education that we remember, from the scholastic era, is you just repeat the thing over and over until it's drummed into your head, and then you can say it. Presumably, in the memorization, you actually know what it means, and you eventually believe it. But rote memorization of prayers is the model. And again, contrast this with put the text in the hands of the congregants and let them think of how this is going to be a guide for their life. It's a very, very different approach. And I think, as I mentioned, the art is I think the real novelty here is an emphasis not on teaching through words, but through the sights and the sounds and the smells and the dazzling theatricality of the Mass, which becomes kind of like a performance, and it is beautiful, and the music is stunningly gorgeous, and the Baroque churches that go up everywhere, not just through Europe, but especially in Mexico and the New World. Even if you look at the missions in California, if you look at the style that informs them as late as the 18th century, it's still essentially Baroque. I was in Mission Santa Barbara not that long ago, and it's totally, it's a little more neoclassical than that, but gosh, what was the one I saw even more recently than that? It's San Francisco in Santiago, in Chile. What's the city I'm thinking of? I was just there a couple of weeks ago. Anyway, the church is San Francisco, but it's a Baroque church, which is a very energetic, active, moving, passionate, even erotic kind of style that is, so I want you to picture, actually just do it. Just Google Baroque churches, and you will see angels blowing trumpets, swags and festoons, and this kind of glorious kitsch. I don't know how else to describe it. It is overwhelmingly beautiful. And a lot of medieval churches are actually remodeled in Baroque, and in fact, it's kind of weird because if you go through Rome, you'll see that there are a lot of there's some medieval stuff, but there's some beautiful Renaissance buildings, and then you get to the 17th century Baroque ones, and you go, yeah, okay, they messed this one up, but I shouldn't say that, but it's because anywhere else you'd stop and drop in awe at the Baroque, but it could not possibly be more contrasted with the very plain, clabbered, boring Protestant church where they don't want you distracted from the word, so they're just going to put white walls up. The Catholic Baroque churches are festooned with a kind of, sometimes even with a kind of horror vacuum of curly cues and swags and again, I think there's no way I can describe this. You have to look at it, okay? So stop and look now. There was also a new religious order committed to defend and spread the church militant and triumphant, and of course I'm talking about the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits as they're often called, who are partly missionaries, means that they're spreading the word. They're partly trying to regain places for Catholicism. They are seminary trained in persuasion, and they are sent into Germany to retake the Rhine. They're sent into Austria. They're in Belgium, where they assume that they can, launch an offensive against the Protestant Netherlands and against England. They are largely the people responsible for the first move of missionary activity in the New World, in India, in China, and especially in Japan. In fact, the Jesuits there are ultimately the reason why the Portuguese get kicked out of Japan, as they have an extraordinary missionary effort. And if you go to a place like Macau, the remains of the cathedral are just there on the hill in the center of the city. It is remarkable how much work and energy they did, and this was done partly because they get a special order from the Pope at the time that allows them to dispense with the normal monastic saying the mass throughout the day, living secluded from the world. They are a very active order that's in the world, and dispensation from everything we really know about monasticism is they move in courts. They go anywhere they can to do what they consider God's work, and don't have those kind of restrictions that most monastic orders do. But of course, they're celibate, right? And by the mid 17th century, you could say much of Protestant Europe is actually retaken by the sword and by the spearhead of the Jesuit order. Okay. The founder, let me talk about Ignatius Loyola, because he's really, the order takes on its character because of him personally. He was Spanish by birth. He lived the first part of his life as a soldier, in fact, involved in those wars between France and Spain that we talked about, in the middle of the course. And in one particular battle, he got a cannonball shot right into the leg, and it was reset a few times. He remained hobbled for the rest of his life. So his profession as a soldier was over. But he went through, on his sickbed, a kind of conversion experience in which he was determined, it seems, to become a saint. And in fact, he wrote an autobiography. Read it. It's a fabulous book. And he said, okay, I'm going to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. I'm going to, if I can't be a soldier for the state, I'm going to be a soldier for Jesus, more or less. Okay. And he took this very seriously. He's kind of, praying day and night, fasting, flagellating himself, all those things that monastic people do, begging for food. And in fact, he got to a point where he almost killed himself. And his confessor said, Ignatius, stop it now. You have to eat. You're going to kill yourself, and that would be a sin. You're going to go to hell. And he said, okay, I will obey you, because that is strict obedience, is part of being a good Christian, acceptance of the orders that are given to you, exactly as would happen in the military, right? Someone gives you an order, you don't question it, you don't think about it, you just do it, because that's an order. That's the way the strict hierarchy works. That's exactly how the Jesuit order works. It's organized like an army. There is a general, not an abbot. Okay, it is an army, and I think in fact, his little book of spiritual exercises is really very interesting, because there's a point where he declares he is ready to believe that what seems to him white is black if the church declares it to be so. Meaning that you don't trust your senses, you don't trust your intuition, you don't do it, you obey the orders. And that's, of course, exactly how a soldier is sort of broken down, demoralized, his individuality is taken away, and that makes him an order-obeying machine, right? Then he could just do whatever anyone says, and if they say this page is black, you believe it. That's the sort of cornerstone to the rigor of the Jesuit order. So in any case, Ignatius does actually get to Jerusalem. He also gets in trouble with the Inquisition, because the things he's thinking are not, traditional Christian practice. And most importantly, though, he gets, he and a handful of friends, some of whom are, very important in the whole order, Francis Xavier, for example, are in Paris at the university. They get the idea to start a company, meaning like an army, right, to instruct children and illiterate people, and they take a special vow of obedience to the Pope, and they vow that they will create a new kind of monastic order that is active, not contemplative. Okay, so that in itself is rather different, and the society is eventually established. Pope Paul III gives them the title, the Regimini Militantis Ecclesiae, the regime of the militant church, organized like an army, and their task is to propagate the faith, regain Protestants within the fold, and missionary activity among the non-Christians. And the society grew into this big army. There's no other way to describe it, with a chain of hierarchy. By the mid-16th century, they have a few thousand members. I mean, we're talking very, very energetic. And their legacy, of course, is they started opening up schools and educating children. They started poor relief centers for feeding the downtrodden, and everything was dedicated to really to field work rather than prayers in a monastery, and of course their role in higher education is central, right? I mean, there's so many schools around that are still Jesuit schools, not just Notre Dame. Santa Clara, right over there is a Jesuit school. Georgetown, Fordham, they get in the education business. And this is the greatest irony of the whole story, is that the education they put in place is founded on classical Latin. And they become, interestingly, the greatest classicists of the next era, meaning that the kind of Renaissance revival of pure Latin, their strongest proponents, ironically, are the Jesuits, who will teach that stuff to another generation, and their theological discourses, their reports on the New World, their scientific things, oddly enough, are written in pure classical Latin, and they are one of the reasons that classical Latin dominates from the 16th century right down to the end of the 19th century. I know we've been talking about the importance of language and linguistics. It's gone now, right? Unless you go to a Jesuit school, you can still study classical Latin. But I've noticed, among Renaissance scholars, many of whom are Jesuits, right? Their Latin is, they blow everyone out of the water. They're so good at it because they're trained from being children to read and speak classical Latin, which no one does. I mean, almost everyone starts as an adult, and then it's harder, obviously. So that's a weird legacy, okay? And obviously the whole educational system of the Jesuits is the major legacy, right down to this day. But I would say the thing that is maybe the most interesting part of the new Catholic Reformation piety is a kind of new devotion, an emotionally charged, kind of passionate mysticism that is, I think, really appealed to Catholics, and I think in a way that kind of scholastic theology never was going to, because it was Latin for one, but also because it was so abstract, so complicated, and written in a form that is just not very accessible. This new kind of mysticism and books that were meant to actually be read by people in the vernacular, I think creates a new energy. I would say the best example of this is Saint Teresa of Avila. Although Saint Teresa, I don't know, there have been speculations that she came from this group of heretical Illuminados. Certainly her ideas are similar to theirs, this kind of inner moving of the inner spirit. But the church, rather than persecute, said, let's use her. Let's use her as a tool. Let's control what she says carefully. Let's check everything that's published, because remember, there's printing now. And those books, when they go out, that's fine. As long as there's nothing heretical in there, let's use this as a tool for propagating faith. It's a very different attitude in the Middle Ages, where it's just someone we can't control, shut that person up. Saint Teresa they used, but the result is this very interesting Spanish woman. The stress on the images, the relics, the ornaments, the passion in piety. I think her works are they're amazingly strange and terrifying. And I think the only way I can kind of describe this to you is you have to stop and look at the sculpture by Bernini that's a sculpture based on a passage in one of her books, where she's imagining this little angel comes by and plunges an arrow into her heart, and she feels this pain, but it's pleasurable, and there's nothing so wonderful, and the imagery is overtly sexual. I mean, there's no way to deny that. And if you look at the way Bernini interprets this, she's lying draped in this orgasmic state as the angel happily plunges the arrow into her heart over and over again. Flaming arrow, I should mention. And that's kind of the aesthetic of the Catholic Reformation in a nutshell. Obviously, that's done in the 17th century. She's writing earlier, but I think the paintings of this era, a kind of ecstatic worship, and ecstasis means in your place. Ecstasis means taken out of your bodily experience. And the interesting thing is, there's a whole wave of miraculous saints, of levitating nuns, of miracles being performed. I mean, it's remarkable, because of course there's a lot of that going on in the later Middle Ages. It's not so important in the Renaissance. When we get to the Baroque again, it's the people carrying medals and amulets around, the medals with them, rosary beads, but also miracles happening, and new saints, lots of new saints in the 17th century. So I would say, if you have a moment and you're interested in this, read The Interior Castle. That's, I think, one of St. Race's best books. It's an allegory of the soul as a castle being defended by the onslaught of vipers and lizards and venomous creatures, and all of these, of course, symbols for sin. And she works herself through these 7 successful mansions, and then finally has this mystical marriage with Jesus that is overtly erotic. And I would say, the other person who is, I think, indicative of this era is St. Francis de Sales, who wrote this book of spiritual exercises that was made for ordinary people to tell them, like physical exercises. You go through this rigorous process of prayer, and that strengthens your faith. And it's something you can work hard toward. Remember, there's still free will, right? So, and the idea is that this is possible for all humans. It's very optimistic in that sense, but it kind of imposes a certain intellectual and practical rigor on people that helps them along. Is that it's not just show up to church, pay your money, give to, pray to the saint. It's it's a new interior kind of religion that has just not been there in medieval or even Renaissance Christianity. It's a new kind of personal structuring of religious experience that are exercises that will lead you to faith and the things that are private. Remember, this is outside the sacraments. This is stuff you do to meditate, to become better, that will help your individual devotion. And I think St. Francis is very interesting in that respect. There's a whole wonderful passage in that book where he's talking about food and the temptation of food, and the not to be pleasurable, and not to spend all your time thinking about the wonderful food you had before and the wonderful food you're going to have tomorrow. And it seems like he's talking about gastronomy. He's actually talking about sex, which is just, he doesn't want to put it there in the text, but I think that makes it very interesting. So again, the other thing is the proliferation of saints, of miracles, the preserving of their bodies, because remember, when saints die, they not only are incorruptible, but they exude a sweet odor that apparently, but the relics come back into fashion, and relics of St. Francis himself, of St. Carlo Borromeo, of there's a whole new slew of theologians and saints and people receiving the stigmata, or miraculous fasting accounts. It's a really fascinating period in that respect. And there are new religious orders. There's the Ursulines, that women who teach. There are confraternities. There are new saints, as I mentioned. A new kind of asceticism. And the work that I've done in this field is a rethinking of the importance of fasting. Now, if you remember, most of the Protestant churches kind of just got rid of them, or the English held on to them in a formal way, but really they go out of practice. It's never enforced. The Protestants, the Calvinists, remember, reinstitute Old Testament kind of fasts, but the Catholic Church is it's fish on Friday and no meat on Saturday is the real fasting day, but it starts on Friday night, and they re-emphasize the whole cycle of Lent, and it's and it is only meat, right? It's not like it post 1964 that you can give up whatever you want. It only means meat, and of course that tradition is still there in much of the Catholic world, reforming the. I guess I already talked about Pius V, but a kind of moral reform, cutting down on banqueting and and the luxury of the Vatican and the the whole trappings of the church change. Pius thought, well, we can't have pagan images and nudity and so the whole idea of decorum, that's what I've been trying to reach for, is that the stuff that seemed pagan or illicit or right in the Vatican, that stuff is forbidden, and the art has to be toward the glory of God and not pagan. So the Catholic Reformation was also a political movement, and this is really where I should sort of tie in the threads of the course to bring them together, is that the effort to destroy Protestant states and impose Catholicism by force was something that happened in the whole century following the Council of Trent. The formation of the League, in which France was sort of preoccupied, the civil wars there, but most importantly, everything Philip II, the King of Spain, did was the wars in the Netherlands, the Spanish Armada, all of that stuff is a result of the efforts to reconvert Europe by invasion of army if necessary, by Jesuits doing intrigue and cloak and dagger kind of stuff, and of course it's a fascinating story. And I think the League could have done it. And remember, the money that's coming from the New World, the silver, was going directly into these efforts in Europe. But it was the fact that the finance tried to cover so many different points at once, not just invading England and holding on to France as Catholic and fighting against Germans, but also fighting against the Turks, believe it or not, right? I mean, Lepanto is 1571 in the course of all of this, and then spending money in the Italian wars, spending money in the New World, right? All the armies and things left. So it's really, I think, dispersal of effort in terms of political effort, is that the wealth and power that could have probably re-Catholicized Europe was diffused everywhere, especially including the New World. I mean, that's where, if you wanted to make a fortune and get yourself a title, you didn't hang around in Europe. You went to Mexico or Peru or the Caribbean or whatever. So the success, and this is the strange and ironic part of this, doesn't take place in the 16th century. The Spanish crown goes bankrupt ultimately. It happens in southern Germany, Bavaria, Austria, Bohemia, and Poland also, places that were kind of slipping, that had their own indigenous Protestant movements, in fact, but that kind of were forced back into the fold of Catholicism in the course of the 30 Years' War. And I've mentioned that before, but just to reiterate, 1618 to 1648, Germany and most of Eastern Europe is almost completely devastated by 40 years of war. Certainly they're dislocated, And this begins in Bohemia with the revolt of the Protestant nobles, what's called the defenestration of Prague. In Prague, when they don't like someone, they throw them out of a window. In fact, you can go into the castle and look out that window where they threw people from the Middle Ages all the way up to the 50s. They would just throw. That's what the defenestration. Fenestra means window. So, but that triggers a war in which the Protestant, the Calvinist, the Elector of the Palatinate, which is the Rhineland, enters in to fight for Calvinism, and then he was crushed by the forces of the Emperor at the Battle of the White Mountain, which is in Bohemia, and then sort of Austria is forcibly reconverted. Vienna Protestantism is knocked out entirely. And that war takes so many very fascinating, weird turns, and I obviously don't have enough time to go into this all, but the hero of the war, ironically, is the King of Sweden, is Gustavus Adolphus, who comes with an entirely revived kind of army and marches right into Prague, and so the long term, if you want to understand why countries like Poland and Austria and Bohemia and sort of the front line of what was Catholicism could have been Protestant, why those places, and southern Germany, of course, why those places remain Catholic, I think you have to look to the 30 Years' War as forceful reconversion. And of course, if you want to know why much of the rest of the world is Catholic, Central and South America, Mexico, the Caribbean, nascent, even missionary effort in China and beginning in Japan. I think that the Catholic Reformation is really why that happened and how. And it's through the use of a new kind of Christianity, the art of the Baroque, the Jesuit order. Eventually, of course, other religious orders get into the missionary activity, including the Franciscans who came to California. But they're the kind of tail end of the movement that really starts in the middle of the 16th century. And if you want to, sort of get a sense of the first Europeans who came and imposed their rule upon California, that's just the tail end of this whole movement. And obviously, they introduced Catholicism, right? So I guess that's the course. I'll tell you when we're going to have a final and the rest of that stuff. But if you have any questions, just send me an email. Okay? Easy as that. So thanks. Been a pleasure to have you in my tea room.